Good morning. My name's Taylor Randall. I'm Dean of the David Eccles School of Business, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our fourth installment of the series, Navigating COVID-19, How to Save Your Business. This is being brought to you by the Mariner S. Eccles Institute for Economics and Quantitative Analysis here at the University of Utah. We're pleased to be broadcasting this to all businesses throughout the state of Utah and beyond, thanks to a grant from the George S. and Dolores Dory Eccles Foundation. This is also an intellectual collaboration between Levitt Partners and the Cynosure Group. We're also grateful to the guidance of the Governor's Economic Task Force and the Salt Lake Chamber of Commerce. Today, we're going to be talking about cash, because in this environment, cash is absolutely king. You're going to find out from experts what your limitations are and what you can do to get creative about your cash flow. It's now my privilege to introduce to you the host of our show, former governor of the state of Utah, Mike Levitt, who also served as Health and Human Services Secretary under George W. Bush. Mike has had an incredible experience planning pandemics and navigating those for the United States of America. Mike, over to you.
Well, thank you, Taylor, and good morning, everyone. We meet again, each of us in our appropriately social distance setting, again, as Taylor suggested, to focus on how to save your business. This is, in fact, our fourth time meeting. We have had some very useful conversation. For those of you who may have missed them, let me talk about some of the very basic things that we believe are important, immediate actions that each of us need to be focused on. The first one is starting to think about this COVID-19 as a long-term risk that needs to be managed, not just a short-term issue that can be solved. That's an important mindset, because many of the decisions that we make will in fact require management over an extended period. The second is to act promptly. Even if actions are not perfect, if our insight is not perfect, we need to move. That means that we can iterate and get closer. If we're directionally correct, our frequent iterations will allow us to succeed. Third, utilizing the resources that are available. We've talked a lot about the CARES Act and about credit partner and the way we would interact with our credit partners. That's an important component. Communicating frequently with our key stakeholders, our employees, and those that we depend on to make our businesses successful, and looking for ways to adapt our businesses so that we can prepare for what will undoubtedly be a new version of normal. On Friday of last week, we had the Vice Chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank of Governors, Randy Quarles. Randy is a Utahn and came to help us understand the quite remarkable degree of effort that the national government has gone to in its monetary system. He talked about fiscal tools like the $2 trillion stimulus package, a part of which is the payroll protection plan that we've discussed at some length. We spoke of monetary tools that have been put into place, like the $2.3 trillion package that the Federal Reserve put forward for loans to businesses that are slightly larger. And we talked about the Federal Reserve's efforts to keep liquidity in a position that it will, in fact, allow our economy to continue to work. So today we're going to continue the discussion. As Taylor suggested, we're going to talk about cash and its importance, how we protect it, how we can begin to assure that we have enough of it to keep going. The program today will be led, first of all, by Matt Ringenberg, who will be introduced in just a moment, but he'll be talking about planning for an uncertain future and moderating our discussion today. Steve Johnson will be talking about tips for managing your cash flows. Kurt Caroz will be talking about the ways of being able to triage our business cash flow. And Sherilyn Olson will be talking about options for working with creditors. We'll then have a panel of businesses who will share their experience. Now, may I say that throughout the course of this, we desire it to be an interactive conversation. we will have a question and answer period at the end. You'll note at the bottom of your screen a chat function. If you'd like to ask a question, please pull up the chat area and list your question. We'll get to them at the end. We'd like to accumulate as many as we can, and you can direct them to any one person or a member of the panel or any of the panelists as we go along. So let me now introduce Matt Ringenberg, who is an associate professor of finance at the David Eccles School of Business at the University of Utah. Matt, we're looking forward to learning from you.
Thank you, Governor Levitt, and thank you all for joining us today. I am a finance professor at the University of Utah, and of course that means I love all things finance. But my students often tell me that not everyone loves finance as much as I do, and even though I have a really, really hard time believing that, deep down I know it's true. So don't worry, we're not going to give a finance lecture today. Instead, what we've done is we've assembled this really amazing panel of experts who are going to just talk about some very simple, actionable advice with the goal of making sure that businesses can emerge from this thing stronger than ever before. So I know there's all sorts of things that business owners are thinking about right now, and it can seem a little bit overwhelming. But if we could provide just one piece of financial advice, it would be this: focus on cash flow management. Cash pays the bills, right? By some measures, more than 80% of all business failures are due to poor cash flow management. And all of the speakers today are going to talk about their experiences with cash flow management. And we're going to get a variety of perspectives. We have a lot of local business owners. We're going to hear the banking perspective. We're going to hear the legal perspective. We're even going to talk with someone who's been dealing with this crisis since January, which is before most of us had even kind of thought about it. And so we're going to think a lot about how cash flow management can help us plan so that we can kind of come through this thing successfully on the other side. So at a high level, the idea when I say cash flow management, what I mean is we want to track how much money is coming into and is leaving your business, right? So, and I want to distinguish between cash flow and something like revenue or profit. So it's possible that you could sell something to a customer and they might have 30 days or even 90 days to pay you. So you don't actually get that money even when you book the revenue, right? So it can't be used to pay the bills. So when we talk about cash flow management today, we want to talk and focus about the actual money entering and exiting your business. So once you sit down, get a handle on all your sources and uses of cash, one of the things that would be really beneficial in a climate like this is to form projections. Think through different scenarios. Think about what could happen in 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, 18 months. It's very possible that even when we emerge from the current kind of stay-at-home situation that we're in right now, we don't just go 100% back to normal. And so you really want to plan through what your cash flows are going to look like in possible scenarios so that you can prepare for that, right? You want to forecast what your cash flows will look like in a variety of scenarios so that you're ready for it. So for example, if you run a restaurant, what happens if you have to keep every other chair open for the next few months, or maybe every other table open for the next few months? If you run a gym or a yoga studio, and we're going to hear from some yoga studio owners today, what would happen if there's a regulation that says you can't have more than maybe 10 people in a room? So what we want to do is we want to think through all these different scenarios that could happen. What happens if we have an additional round or maybe multiple rounds of shelter in place? So think through these scenarios, and by going through those scenarios and thinking what your cash inflows and outflows are going to look like, you can hopefully make adjustments so that you can actually thrive in these different scenarios. So we don't know exactly what's going to happen in the coming months, but that doesn't mean you can't be prepared for different scenarios. So our experts are going to provide all sorts of great advice on thinking through these scenarios, thinking through things that maybe not everyone has thought about so far. And they've got a variety of experiences, I think, that'll be really useful. So with that, I want to talk and turn this over to some of our expert panelists. Our first expert panelist is Steve Johnson. Steve is the CFO of PMI Foods. And so Steve, if I can turn it over to you, can you just give us maybe a 1-minute overview of PMI Foods and what you guys do?
Sure, Matt, thank you. It's great to be here with everyone today. PMI Foods is a global food company. We specialize mainly in proteins. So we buy from areas where there are heavy proteins production and sell to places that lack protein. That's kind of our simple business model. So we do a lot of purchasing from North America, South America, and Europe and Australia. We sell mainly to Asia. So we have a heavy exposure in China. About 80% of our sales actually go to China. And we sell in three models. We sell through a global solutions model, which is like a trading company model. We sell to distribution, where we import and nationalize product in our own subsidiaries. And then in certain parts of the world, in southern Brazil and in China, we have a food service model. So we have been involved with the COVID virus longer than most people. So we were seeing effects of this on our business starting in mid-January. And at that point, when I talked to people about that, they really viewed it as kind of something affecting only China. It wasn't very current to them, and it wasn't something that they understood very well. I remember the first time I spoke to someone from a meat plant who was talking to me about slow payment of bills. I explained to them the situation of COVID-19, the coronavirus, and their response back to me was, well, you should have planned for something like that. And then it became real to that vendor and to everybody else. So now we're in a situation where it's real to all of us. What we found in China is it's been an 8-week, I wouldn't say complete turnaround, but it was 8 weeks of very, very difficult cash flow situation. Now we're back to a position where things are significantly better, but we're not out of the woods yet. But on the topic of, go ahead, Matt.
Well, so I was just going to say, so, I mean, you guys have really been dealing with this then, what you would say, since like mid-January?
Yes.
Can you provide a little bit more perspective then on kind of what this looks like as you've kind of gone through the process? Since I think you've kind of seen where we're going maybe a little bit more than a lot of other people.
Yes. Well, in the beginning, first of all, it's assessing how difficult of a situation you really have, and then trying to determine how best to act both short term and medium term. So in the beginning, this would be kind of my message for the group, is that you have to look at what you can do to make your cash flow improve. And it's probably it says a lot easier than it does sometimes than actually doing it is, but you're looking at ways to accelerate your cash flow, accelerate cash inflows, defer cash outflows, and hopefully turn your assets into cash. So we tried to do that. We looked at collections that we could bring in throughout the world. We also went to our banking partners to open up some lines of credit that we weren't currently using. We also tried to understand with our plants how to defer some of the payments. And really something that for us, because we're a heavy inventory company, is to sell as much inventory as we could, as quickly as we could, hopefully at a reasonable profit. But there is the trade-off between your P&L at this point and your actual need for cash flow.
So that's interesting. Steve, can you talk a little bit then about, how do you actually observe cash flow? Do you guys make reports? What do you look at when you're trying to think?
We have something, and really throughout my career, this is what I've used, but it's especially relevant in the situations like we're facing right now in COVID-19. We have reports that we build that show our inflows from around the world, from the different types of businesses, and then we look at the outflows. So we have a very refined cash flow forecast that we use on a daily basis, and I'm looking at that on every single day. But also what we're trying to do is plan, and I utilize our accounts receivable group, our accounts payable group, and just other features we have developed in a cash flow plan over time to help us understand what's going to be happening this week and later in the month, because we really don't want to be in a position where we're overspending for certain things today, and then in a week we have a big payment, and we don't have a lot of fixed debt payments, but things like that, a rent payment, big payments that we know we have to make, or payments that we have to make to a specific vendor to keep them happy.
And so what do you guys do then if you guys are, looking at these cash flow forecasts and you're thinking about different scenarios? What happens if you kind of look down and you say, I'm not sure we have the money today to pay all of our vendors? Do you have a way of kind of thinking about that?
Well, the way we do that is really looking at a couple of ways. One of the things I would recommend doing is stratifying your vendors. And this is the analogy that I use in this, is me being an international traveler. I fly Delta because I'm a Salt Lake City guy. There's really levels that you have to create for your vendors. So it's a bit of a mind shift change, but if you look at when you fly, a diamond medallion gets treated one way, a platinum medallion gets treated another way, and a regular flyer gets treated a third way. And so some of this that becomes difficult is actually, it's a mindset shift amongst the people sometimes in your business to understand that there are certain people that are not going to be paid this week, they might not be paid next week, and they might not be paid for 3 weeks. And you really need to go through your vendor list and determine who you're guarding, who are the most important vendors. And really, I view it also kind of like the waterfall approach. There's enough water to pay the people in pool 1. If anything trickles down, it goes to pool 2, to pool 3, and to pool 4. That's the way we've done things here when things have been tight with cash flow. And they're not tight all the time, but this isn't the first. This might be the biggest cash flow crisis we've had, but it's not the only crisis we've had. So we've kind of gone through a plan over the course of many years to identify who are the most important partners for us and who are basically irreplaceable. Who could we replace if we needed to? They may be the people that don't pick up the cash flow.
Yeah, so you would kind of prioritize people. And I guess in your analogy, then the diamond people are the ones that just you have to pay today because they're crucial to the operation of what you're doing.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes, and if we didn't have them, we would really significantly hurt our operation long-term and probably short-term as well. Others we can live without for the short term.
Excellent. All right, so thank you very much, Steve. We've got a bunch of other panelists here, and I want to get as many different perspectives in as we can. I'd like to talk a little bit with Kurt Carew. So Kurt is the president of Tab Bank. And Kurt, I guess in many ways, you guys are a small business that's trying to help small businesses right now. Can you just give me a quick overview of what Tab Bank is and what you guys are doing?
Sure, Matt. Thanks. Good morning. So Tab Bank, actually, we're located in Ogden, and we were started in 1998 by a local family. And Crystal Magalit is our primary owner, so local Utah. But we are a small business because we do have 250 employees, but we operate digitally, and we always have. So we help small businesses not only in Utah but all over the country. And that's our specialty. We've always been a completely mobile online solution that provides financial services for small businesses. And 20 years after our founding, we're really obsessed with helping small businesses get to the next level and giving them access to things that maybe larger businesses are used to having.
So Kurt, can you talk a little bit then from the banking perspective? There are all these different programs out there. There's all these different things that business owners should be thinking about. Do you have kind of tips for what business owners should be thinking about right now from the financing or banking perspective?
Yeah, there's two main things I think we should probably address. Let's start with financing and the loan programs that are available. The CARES Act has put trillions of dollars available to help businesses. And what's great about this time around, as we're going through this current, what's expected to be recession, the money has been put forth in a way where it's accessible by all types of businesses. And the most attractive thing that's out there right now is the Paycheck Protection Plan, which we refer to as the PPP, which is a program available to small businesses with less than 500 employees. The main idea of the program, of course, and last week's session talked in detail about it, so I won't get into a lot of the details, but it really is intended to help businesses pay their ongoing expenses, primarily of which is keeping people employed. And so a lot of it has to do, the amount you can borrow is basically equal to 2.5 times 1 month's payroll. And then you can use it for payroll, rent, utilities, et cetera. And a great aspect of it is you're borrowing money at a 1% interest rate. There are no personal guarantees and no collateral required. So it really behaves in a lot of ways more like equity than debt. And so it's the best thing out there, and I would encourage everybody to pursue that. Additionally, we have the EIDL loans, which are also kind of geared towards small businesses. And the benefit of these loans is that they have a 30-year payback, so very low payment requirement going forward, and low manageable interest rates. And additionally, there's an EIDL grant available for $10,000 that can help you bridge the time from when you apply to when you get the money. The PPP hopefully is a fast turnaround and gets access to money quickly. EIDL grants and loans take a little longer. And then, of course, the Utah Leads Together bridge loan is available for small companies with less than 50 employees. All of these really are an opportunity for businesses to get a hold of immediate liquidity to bridge the gap. So we talk about cash flow. I think cash flow and liquidity, not exactly the same things, but we have to think about those in tandem.
Thanks, Kurt. So then Steve was kind of talking a little bit about things like prioritizing your vendors. I mean, do you have tips from the bank perspective on, conversations you should have with your creditors, conversations you should have with your bank, how you kind of think about the cash flow management side of things?
Yeah, so in cash flow, I think it's really important to be very transparent with people you owe money to and relentless with people that owe you money, right? So let's start talking about the people you owe money to, the banks and then the creditors and your vendors and such. And I think Steve did a great job of talking about the waterfall. I think that's critical. You need to figure out what's your most important expenses and you need to prioritize them. And a lot of times the people you owe money to, some of the smaller or least important ones might be the loudest. They may be calling you multiple times a day. They might be threatening, et cetera. You really have to filter out the noise and prioritize which ones are most important. In terms of talking to your bankers, one thing I want to point out is there's an unprecedented amount of volume right now, not only in the loan request for PPP that we mentioned and other things, but also in requesting assistance from your bank. So you also have to be relentless with them. You have to continue to try to contact them. If you have a relationship manager at your bank that you already know, then I would focus on that person. If you don't, you need to call and email just repeatedly until you can talk to someone. When you do get a hold of someone, you need to be very transparent about your situation. This is what I need. This is where I am. And in that regard, I would tell you that there's an unprecedented amount of support available to banks to help out their customers. And so I never in my almost 40-year banking career have I seen the regulators and governmental bodies encourage banks to work with their customers as much as they are now. So much so that they've even gotten accounting rules changed so that we don't have to count some of the modifications we do for clients as what's called troubled debt restructuring. And so we can do deferrals of payments for 1 month, 3 months, even 6 months, and not be subject to criticism by our regulators. And so when you think about that, that's pretty impactful, powerful tools that banks have. Now, that doesn't mean that they necessarily have the bandwidth to reach out to you. Now, our bank luckily is, and we have been reaching out to our clients, but you have to go to your bank and ask and be relentless about it because there's a lot of accommodations they can do for customers today, and it's unprecedented.
So Kurt, one other thing I just wanted to ask you. I mean, I think right now, one of the most difficult things for all of us is that we just kind of don't know what tomorrow is going to look like. If I remember correctly, you actually lived in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina. Did that provide any perspective, or does that influence any way in which you're kind of thinking about how you plan for an uncertain future?
Yeah, so it's interesting that it feels a lot the same today. It's a good analogy because we lost our house, we lost all of our possessions, one of our cars, just about everything you can imagine. And we had left New Orleans the day before the hurricane ended up in Houston. And I remember walking around for the first couple of months in kind of a state of shock. And so there's a couple of pieces of advice that I can say that came from that. One is um, don't let the fear of the future paralyze you. Start taking action. What we learned was that we could only really handle what we could control, which was the next thing in front of you. So if you're a small business owner, don't think about what it, necessarily get obsessed by what my business is going to look like 6 months from now. None of us know. But you do know you can take certain actions today and focus on those because as you make progress, the rest of the world will clear up around us. And so, a couple months after Hurricane Katrina, different grants and aid and FEMA money started coming through. You could find out what you're going to get from your insurance company, your bankers, what kind of relief you're going to get from them, et cetera. And it all kind of fell into place. And we started operating in a new normal. And that's exactly what's going to happen for us when we don't know the pace of it. So we need to focus on things we can do now. And like I said before, I think liquidity is an important one. If you have lines of credit, make sure they're available. Potentially think about drawing on them now and putting that money in the bank. If you have available credit cards, make sure that your limits are still intact. And if they are, think about ways you can use that now to stock up on inventory, things like that. So understanding where your cash is coming in from and going out from, but also can you bring liquidity forward into today and get as much liquidity as you can kind of socked away.
Yeah, that's great advice. Thank you, Kurt. So I also want to talk a little bit about the legal side of things. So Steve has kind of talked about prioritizing your vendor. Kurt has given us some great tips for kind of thinking about how to interact with your bank, the different options that are available from a funding side. But as some of us go through this and we're having to make tough choices, prioritizing certain vendors, one of the things that I think naturally comes up is, what do you do if you don't have enough money to pay everyone? And so we've got Sherilyn Olson on the call, and Sherilyn is a partner at Holland & Art, and she's really an expert at restructuring and bankruptcy law. And so Sherilyn, I'd love to just hear a little bit about kind of the legal side of things. Can you talk a little bit about different options for working with creditors?
Yes, thank you, Matt. Happy to be involved. So you've already, as our other speakers have suggested, you've already identified your sources of cash and are working towards maximizing them. You've already identified your uses of cash and prioritized your critical members of your success team. So you've got whether that pool includes landlords, vendors, employees. You've got all those people on your priority list, and then it's time to get started. The first round that I typically recommend, and keep in mind, I represent on both sides of the equation. So for my lenders, I'm a bit of an undertaker. And then for my business clients, I'm the EMT that comes in and tries to resuscitate the struggling business. And so there's various phases that you would seek to try to intervene and help your clients turn around their businesses and be able to be successful. The first step is going to be communicating for breathing room, especially in this day, in this crisis. This can be a solution that can buy you anywhere from 30 to 90 days of time. Things are changing. Lenders, creditors are still working through their own plans. And you can buy time simply by communicating and asking questions regarding options and providing information that's been requested from your creditors. So the first phase really is just trying to buy you a short window of time to figure out your options and evaluate what's available. And being communicative with your creditors and lenders during that phase is just critical. The second option that comes up that can give you additional time, typically anywhere between 3 to 12 months. However, in this business environment, in this economic environment, you may be able to even extend forbearance agreements out 18 to 24 months. A forbearance agreement is an agreement that sets forth the terms of a temporary arrangement when the customer or borrower is in default. And they typically take two forms: temporary relief that results in a return to original loan terms, or a temporary relief that results in an exit. But either way, a written forbearance agreement can really provide some agreed upon terms of needed relief, whether that is a waiver of default interest, whether it's a forbearance from the borrower fulfilling certain interest obligations, a temporary elimination of principal payments, or potentially just a reduction. I often seen step ups. So we have, the first 3 months, your principal interest payments are X, and then 3 months from now, they're going to step up to Y. And then 3 months after that, they'll step up to Z, and hopefully be a lot closer to what the original parties' agreements were as things improve overall. You can also, through forbearance agreements, seek relief and forbearance from financial covenants. That's a big one. There's lots of borrowers out there who can continue to make the monthly principal and interest payments, but are going to be in violation of various financial reporting covenants, whether those are fixed coverage ratios, senior indebtedness ratios, EBITDA, financial reporting covenants. But a forbearance agreement allows you to kind of put all those defaults based on those covenants on pause, and allows you to continue to operate and do your business despite being in default. You can also negotiate as part of these forbearance agreements deferrals or waivers of late fees. You can also ask for affirmative waivers and discounts based on achieving certain benchmarks. So for example, if you're able to hit reduced covenants by a certain date, or you're able to achieve certain gross income results or net income results for your business by certain dates, perhaps the lender or creditor will then be willing to absolutely waive certain interest payments, default interest payments, attorney's fees and costs, and late fees. And attorney's fee and cause are typically pretty easy to get out of if you're a borrower, because those are, at least for regulated lenders, treated differently than principal, interest, and late fee payments. And the banks account for them in different ways. And so you can ask for those to be waived typically if you can satisfy the other terms of the forbearance agreements. Let's talk about a more long-term solution. That would be an actual loan modification. Typically, lenders will want to see, maybe do a forbearance for a short period of time and see if you can satisfy those criteria and benchmarks before they will agree to affirmatively change your loan documents. But this is the time to ask for it. If you need a permanent change in your loan facilities, you need new financial covenants, you need a new repayment schedule, you need new amortization, this is the time to ask for it and try to negotiate that into a long-term loan modification plan that would be a permanent change to your repayment obligations. Let's talk about the worst case scenario for many, which would be a Chapter 11 bankruptcy. A lot of people don't like to say the B word, but let me tell you some advantages that can come about if you really are in a place where you have to start considering other options. Your creditors are not working with you. You can't get a forbearance agreement to the period of time that you really need to make your business be successful. Things have changed again. The loan modification is not working. A Chapter 11 bankruptcy plan can provide you with an opportunity to continue to operate your business in the ordinary course while taking advantage of the bankruptcy stay. The automatic stay prohibits creditors from kicking you out of your property. It prohibits creditors from collecting against your accounts receivable. It prohibits creditors from coming after your assets and gives you breathing room to propose a plan to pay your creditors back over time, and really can allow businesses to rise from the ashes with a clean slate and provide new opportunities for you to create a long-term plan for business success. A disadvantage of bankruptcy typically is that it can be very expensive. But let me tell you some new things that are in place to help ease that burden right now. The Small Business Reorganization Act of 2019 that came into effect in February created a new subchapter for Chapter 11 small businesses. And single asset real estate businesses don't qualify. But if you have secured and unsecured debts of less than $2.7 million, you could take advantage of this mini Chapter 11 process that's incredibly less expensive, less time consuming, and less onerous. And let me tell you about one other big advantage right now to take advantage of this is that the CARES Act actually expanded those caps. So now any business with less than $7.5 million of secured and unsecured debt can take advantage of this small Chapter 11 process. Keep in mind that under the CARES Act, this expansion of this up to $7.5 million expires. It expires on March 27th, 2021. So if you are, if the communication is working, take advantage of that. If forbearance is working, take advantage of that. But keep in mind that you've got a little under a year to really evaluate whether or not taking advantage of this small Chapter 11 process can provide you with some additional protections. The difference in this small Chapter 11, you have shorter deadlines, you have greater flexibility, you don't have to put together a disclosure statement, no creditors have to vote on a plan of reorganization. There's a different fair and equitable standard that simply says if your plan provides for attributing all disposable income, so after taking in consideration of your expenses to pay your creditors all disposable income for the next 3 to 5 years, you arrive as a clean company and any debts you haven't repaid or wiped away. It can really provide you with some added protections and some added time to reorganize if these other avenues aren't working. And it's the subchapter 5, this new provision of a mini 11, is going to be substantially cheaper for you and your business compared to the larger Chapter 11. One other thing that, go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to kind of summarize real quickly too, just to make sure that kind of we were connecting all the dots. I think, Kurt talked a little bit about the Hurricane Katrina experience and just thinking about, not being afraid of this uncertain future. So there really are a lot of specific actions that people can take right now, right? So your kind of advice would be do the communication. If that doesn't work, look into the forbearance agreements that can provide you with some kind of temporary breathing room. If that doesn't work, then maybe pursue some more loan modifications. And if that doesn't work, then you can go on and explore some of these other programs. Is that basically right?
Absolutely. And a lot of the decisions you'll be making is going to be determined on how aggressive your creditors are and how successful you are in being able to negotiate with your critical creditors some kind of temporary relief.
Excellent, excellent. All right. So I'd also like to get a little bit of perspective from some of the local business owners that we've got here on the line. So we've heard a little bit about Steve, who's kind of been working through the cash flow side of this for quite a while. We heard from Kurt. We heard kind of the banking perspective. Sherilyn gave us an overview. There are a bunch of different avenues that businesses can pursue in terms of kind of the legal side, so that they can help navigate this crisis. But I want to hear a little bit from just local business owners. We've got a bunch of business owners on the line. And since I like structure and order, I think it makes sense to just go alphabetically. So by last name, Cody Dent would be first in line. Cody, could you just tell us a little bit about your business and kind of what you guys do?
Yeah, so I am the CFO of Vibrant Management. We are a management company that has about 14 properties scattered throughout the state. We focus primarily in tourism and hospitality, with majority of our businesses being around our national parks.
Excellent. So, and I think you guys have a lot of exposure in southern Utah. Is that right?
Yeah, we do. So most of our businesses are around Zion National Park, and then we've got one up by Capitol Reef as well, and then one that's based out of Park City. But most of our focus is around the Zion National Park area.
So could you talk a little bit now? I mean, I think a lot of the national parks are closed. People really aren't traveling much for recreational purposes right now. Have you guys, thinking back to what some of the other speakers have talked about, have you guys explored things like the paycheck protection loans or some of the other financing avenues that people have mentioned so far?
Yeah, so tourism has been hit extremely hard, especially now with all of the national parks being closed. So we have, in pretty much all of our organizations, applied for the EIDL loan and the PPP loan. The interesting thing about the PPP loan in certain instances is it doesn't have necessarily the implied impact, because for our retail center that we have, we wouldn't really be able to open back up because there is no one in the park. So there wouldn't really be any reason to have the staff there. And where our staff can actually earn more on unemployment with the $600 stimulus, it would be challenging to even ask them to come back and just be there for nothing. So, but what we can do is there's still a lot of other benefits. So we had ordered a bunch of inventory, of course, to prepare for the season, which has net 30-day terms. Steve and Kirk kind of talked about that. And those terms are now going to become due. And there's not any way for us to pay those because we haven't had any sales to build up our funds. But now we can take that PPP loan and use those funds and put it towards our inventory, which we don't have any payments for 6 months. And then at that time, it only becomes a 1% interest loan. So that's a great alternative for us. So we're just being really strategic in utilizing every one of the funding programs that are available, and just being strategic in how we apply those. It may not be the desired intent, but they still have a tremendous value for us.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, Kurt, do you have thoughts on kind of what Cody is doing? I mean, it sounds like they're kind of taking advantage of these programs, but maybe in slightly different ways.
Yeah, no, I think Cody, I think they're doing the right thing. When you think about the intent of the program, it is to keep people employed. But as Cody noted, you can't necessarily control what's best for your employees and what they're going to end up doing. And the worst case, when you go back for relief from the loan, so potentially 100% of a PPP loan could be forgiven. However, you can use it for other expenses. So if you use 75% for future payroll and 25% for rent and utilities, you could still get 100% forgiven. But let's assume that you can't put the pieces back together or get employees back in, or things haven't reopened when you thought they might. You still end up with a loan that's got a 1% interest rate payable over 2 years, and so it's very cost effective. And as I said before, it's almost like capital. And so there's really hard to imagine a way you could lose by taking advantage of the PPP program.
Thank you, Kurt. So Cody, I guess you guys also have a bunch of lodging properties, right?
Yeah.
I guess I'm curious to know if you could talk a little bit about what does the cash flow situation look like for those properties now, both inflows and outflows?
Yeah, so the inflows have been really challenging. I mean, for most of our businesses, we're almost at a point where there is no inflow at all. And then so Steve talked about it with the airline status. We just have to be really strategic with all of our partners as to who we owe, who we can pay, and who we can't. And I don't remember if it was Kurt or Steve who said this, but the most important thing we can do is just be transparent with all of our vendors and letting them know, that we're not able to pay you right now. Give them a deadline of when we think that can, letting them know that we have applied for all of the funding that's available. And obviously, once that comes through, we'll have an opportunity to be able to start making payments on those. But we just have to be upfront and honest. And sometimes that's difficult and hard to acknowledge as a business owner that you're in that situation. But the fact remains that that is the situation that we're in. And I found that when we're honest and transparent with our vendors, they're very accepting and understanding of the situation that we're in. And for lodging specifically, we've got a property in Torrey, and they were off to just a great start this year. They were going to have the best year that they've ever had. And now they have not had a single booking in the last 10 days. And that would be for any time in the future. So their business has basically come to a complete halt. And then property that we have around Zion, they were up 35% going into the year so far for the first 3 months. And now since COVID-19 has happened, they've lost over $800,000 in revenue, which isn't something that is easily able to be made up. And then we had another property also in the Southern Utah area that was brand new. They just opened their doors in February. And so now their business has basically stopped before it was ever able to get started. And so they're being strategic and offering their property up for a 1-week rental. But that's for less than what they used to rent for one night apiece. So that's one way that we're trying to get some cash in by giving people a place if they need to get away or self-quarantine, to give them an affordable option for that. But nonetheless, very challenging for a whole gamut of businesses, because one of those businesses has been around for 30 years, one has been around for 20, and that one has been around for less than 1 year. So we're seeing it from all different sides of the impact.
And if you guys, I mean, since this industry has been hit so hard and it just happened so quickly, have you guys had a chance to really sit down and kind of think about what you might project for the, say, medium term, 6 months from now, 12 months from now? Do you guys have thoughts? Do you have plans?
It's really hard. All that we can hope is that given that we've got this economic stimulus with all of the funds that people receive from the IRS, and then hopefully people getting their jobs back through the PPP, is that's going to give people consumer confidence and feel like they want to travel again. And then being that we are in the national parks and we're outdoors, and it's about getting outside and being in open space, I believe that we are luckily positioned to be able to pivot when people are ready to travel again. I think that they will be doing things like going to national parks versus going to some metropolitan areas or like a Disneyland or a Disney World. I think that we'll get some of those consumers, and I think some of the international travel, I think that they will be going to national parks again as well. And I think road trips will become a thing that families do again, just to be a little bit more confined. So I think that we are positioned to be able to succeed. And I believe because we had such a dramatic and quick downturn, that our upturn will be equally as quick, is my hope. So I don't believe it'll be like what we saw in 2008 for our industry specifically. And I believe as long as we're all working together and are being smart and strategic in our efforts, that we can have a lot of success.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much, Cody. I want to get time to make sure we talk with some of the other business owners we have on the line. So let's turn next to Rachel Silowitz and Eric Martin. They are the owners of Center City Yoga. And so if I understand correctly, Rachel kind of handles maybe the people-facing side of the business, and Eric does a little bit more of the financial side. So maybe, Rachel, if you could just talk a little bit, in many ways, you guys are a part of your community. Could you just talk a little bit about what you guys do and how you view your contribution to the community?
Sure, I'd love to. We are certainly in what I would consider the service industry. We absolutely rely on our students for, one, just creating a greater community in Salt Lake City in general, but also for our cash flow. And being able to have the heart of our community always in our mind, I feel like is something incredibly important for right now.
And so, and you guys, so your yoga studio is located near 9th and 9th. So I think that's an area that normally just has all sorts of people. What kind of happens then if you guys aren't open?
Well, for us, we've had to be very adaptable. We initially wanted to make sure that we were taking care of our teachers and our staff and our students through connection. And we have right now created secret Facebook pages with groups for our staff and instructors so that they can regularly communicate. And I'm also sending more like kind of heartfelt emails to our entire student base, checking in on them, letting them know that we're still here. We've also created free YouTube videos for our students to be able to still see their teachers and to be able to come take a class even though it's not in person. And that's been incredibly important to take care of the community side of it. And then, oh, okay.
Nope, go ahead.
Okay, so then in terms of just being connected in general, we really want to remember that we have physical aspects of yoga, but there's also this extreme mental and emotional experience that people have. And if they are missing that, we've got to look into the welfare of our students who might be isolated right now. And so the students that I know are isolated, I'm sending personal emails to them, checking in through them with telephone, different ways that I can to let them know that we're here for them and that we're all in this together. And then we've also, a way to adapt, we have launched an online studio, and that's will give our teachers some income and also keep the students who have been able and still willing to pay for passes the ability to take classes in a live setting, but just from their home.
Okay, and so then I guess I'm also curious too. I think a lot of the speakers so far have talked about how you think about planning for the future, and there's all this uncertainty. Do you have thoughts on kind of your role with all the different stakeholders, all the different people you guys affect, and kind of what are you doing to make sure that when this thing is finally kind of over, you guys are still kind of all back together?
Well, first of all, we definitely are keeping in touch with the community. Our students are our business, and as well as our teachers. And if we don't have both of those, we don't have a business at all. So doing the steps that we've taken to keep in touch, to offer online offerings, but to also just absolutely believe that we are going to be back. And we teach students to be resilient. And this is in a lot of ways an opportunity to prove that we believe that and that we act on that. And we are taking steps every day to do what we can to stay in touch. And we have plans that, as however long this is drawn out, that people can actually come in person, or to be able to, like you said earlier, maybe we can only have 10 people in a class. Okay, well, we might shift the line a little bit, that we still have online offerings where we could have unlimited people in a class online with, kind of feathering back in more in-person options, and knowing that we can feather it this way and that and still be able to stay afloat that way through the community.
Yeah, it's interesting too. I always think, necessity is the mother of all invention. And so even though this is a really tough time for a lot of business owners, in some sense, it also represents an opportunity. You guys can innovate and kind of change the way in which you do things. And these online classes are a really interesting way to kind of do that, to keep things going, even if you can't have everyone in a room together. So I'm curious, I guess, Eric, maybe if you can talk a little bit too about just, the financial side of kind of managing all of this. It seems like your business has changed quite a bit. What are you thinking about in that perspective?
Well, what we have to do is we have to step back and recognize what's happened over the last 30 days. And in its simplest form, our business has shrunk by 95% with our normal and traditional offerings. So that means we need to manage all of our expenses. Things that we thought may have been just discretionary before, now all of a sudden need to slide into the pile of we don't do those things anymore. It gets to be a very nuanced conversation when we start talking with landlords, when we start talking with banks and our employees and our suppliers, from the perspective of everybody's important. And at the same time, everything flows back uphill from the perspective of if for instance, we didn't pay our rent in our studio, then the person that owns the building may not be able to put food on the table for his family. And it just continues to move uphill from that perspective. So having very clear, very concise conversations with really all of our stakeholders to make sure that they understand where we are, how we're progressing, what we're doing to both be on pause right now from some avenues and yet be able to also start other lines of business at the exact same time so that we can start to build the business back, and at the end of this have a better and stronger business than when we first came into this pandemic. What's important to consider right now, though, is how do we bridge? How do we get from where we are right now to where we know and understand where we are going to go from a business perspective in the future? And my biggest suggestion for everybody from that perspective is apply for all the financial aid and apply for all the loans and forgiveness programs that you possibly can. We applied for the PPP on the day that it opened, and I was one of those guys that kept hitting retry because the website wasn't fully operational at that point. But we did get the application in, and a few days ago we did receive notice that we were approved for that fully. And what our bank's telling us at this point is we'll receive those funds within the next 2 days. So these programs do work, they are in place, and with that, we can fund the activities that we need to today to move forward so that we'll be in place and ready when things start to open back up again.
And so it's kind of interesting too. I mean, I like how everyone is thinking about, prioritizing things. I'd love to go back to Steve, since Steve has been kind of in this for months already. I mean, he's kind of seen this thing going through multiple phases already. They've been dealing with it since January. Steve, do you have kind of thoughts on, as Rachel and Eric talk, or as Cody talks, on just how people are doing and dealing with these cash flow situations? Do you have any other ideas or tips?
Well, I think it's a challenging situation for everyone, probably more so than we've ever seen in our lives. And I think one thing that in hearing what everybody has talked about, what Cody mentioned, what Rachel and Eric mentioned, I think that you're doing basically the same track that we followed. And I think you just have to continue to do that and watch what happens. But I think one of the key factors here right now is looking at your own companies and looking at your model that you have. Maybe we talked about doing cash flow projections. You probably need to take those out a little bit and stress test them. And by that, I mean you have certain variables that you can modify. So it would be interesting to look and determine, what do you really believe the recovery looks like? So I think Cody mentioned, it was a dramatic drop. Maybe it's again a dramatic rise. People want to go back to Zion. Sounds like a great idea to me. I'd love to do that. And that might make his recovery look one way. There are other industries that the recoveries, in my opinion, are not going to be that way. It's interesting. I read an article about 2.5 weeks ago by Ben Bernanke, or quoted in there that somebody said, this isn't going to be a depression. It's just going to be like a long snowstorm, like a blizzard. And I think, boy, this has really been a long blizzard. It's a really long blizzard. Well, maybe some people are not going to have the V-shaped recovery where they dramatically improve. And so it could be maybe like the U-shape people have talked about. But what would happen if it looked like a V and it turned into a W, right? We got bad again, and then it took a while. So I think for most people, looking at the longer term and really trying to get an understanding of, for your business, what kind of recovery are you going to have? Food service, for example, with restaurants is a whole different animal. Who knows how long it's going to be before everybody's back in the restaurant. So I think it's important to take a look at what you think is going to happen, make your best guess, but then you might want to do a medium kind of recovery. You might want to run a model that shows the bad recovery, just so you're prepared to understand what you might have to do if the recovery doesn't work the way you think it will, or if the timing is longer than all of us hope it's going to be.
Thank you, Steve. I mean, I think, it's interesting. Rachel and Eric talked about kind of transitioning to that online business. And I think you can see how innovative people are being to try to, weather different scenarios. But again, I also think, as you were saying, there's still a lot of uncertainty about what the coming months could look like. And so economists have tried to forecast different scenarios. In a great scenario, we might just have this kind of steep drop and then this steep rebound, which is the so-called V-shaped recovery, in which case, hopefully things go back pretty quickly back to normal. But it's also possible that this will be a prolonged downturn. And so hopefully people can kind of plan through all of this. It sounds like both Cody and Eric and Rachel had talked about getting different financing options. I guess I'd like to maybe go back to Sherilyn quickly and just ask her a quick question. If you're pursuing all of these different financing options, it also makes me start wondering a little bit about maybe the liability side. So are there things we need to think about if we're going out there and we're getting different loans? Sherilyn?
Thank you. Yes. One thing that to keep in mind, the PPP program is great because it doesn't require any sort of guarantor liability. Something to keep in mind, especially when you're looking at trying to put extra cash into your company and try to turn things around, is whether or not you personally are potentially at risk for any of these debts and obligations that are coming due. The standard answer is, as a company structure, it's a separate legal entity from the individual. There's exceptions to that. The exceptions are in extreme circumstances, such as treating the company as your own piggy bank. Are you paying your rent or your mortgage from the company accounts? Transferring money in and out freely between personal accounts and business accounts. But as a whole, the general rule is you are a separate individual and entity from your business, and that your personal assets should not be at risk during this difficult time. The other big exception being whether or not you've personally guaranteed any of these obligations. The PPP program doesn't require that. Your existing lenders may already have guarantees by you. It's important when you're looking at negotiating these forbearance terms or loan modifications that you're keeping in mind the guarantor's obligations. A lender can proceed against all of its remedies. It can go after a business itself. It can go after business assets if they're pledged as collateral. It can go after individual guarantors separately. So if the business files bankruptcy, if the business is in trouble, they can start suing and going after the guarantors and their assets. But if you enter into a forbearance agreement, you can have a lender also forbear from exercising that guarantor liability. So something to keep in mind is that you're not forgetting about the guarantors or other personal risks that may come to owners in this time, and keep that in mind when you're working with your creditors and your lenders, that you're keeping in mind that guarantee liability also. And I just like to reiterate that a lot of the panelists said, this really is a scary time for a lot of businesses. But the good news is that because it's a global crisis, businesses and people are more willing to work together in ways that are unprecedented. Creditors and lenders who were traditionally unwilling to work with borrowers and customers are much more willing to be flexible and work towards win-win solutions. So there's a lot of hope out there, and hang in there. There's a lot of flexibility right now as regulations are being loosened and as everyone's trying to kind of work together to get out of this mess in the best way possible.
Thank you, Sherilyn. All right, so I also want to make sure we get to our last business owner. So we're lucky to have Josh Young on the line. And Josh is the president of Jesco. And I really think Josh has a very interesting perspective on all of this, because Josh runs a mid-sized business. I think they have a little over 1,000 employees. And yet at the same time, they also have a number of franchisees who are basically running small businesses. So Josh kind of sees this from multiple angles. Josh, can you tell us a little bit about Jesco?
You bet. Thanks, Matt, for the opportunity. Jesco is a 100-year-old family sign business that operates really 4 key unique business models. The first is a custom sign manufacturing business, and we produce print signage, your banners and your graphics that can be purchased online, to small wayfinding signage that you'd see in hotels, your business identification signage, and then the large spectacular displays that you see at sporting venues. We have a billboard company that operates and offers billboard advertising in the Rocky Mountain region. And then we have 106 sign and lighting service offices, 60 of which are the franchisees that you mentioned, the small business owners, and then the others are part of our corporate operation. And then we have a leasing company that supports those various activities that we're engaged in.
So then can you talk a little bit, since you've got all these different things going on, what are you seeing and doing right now? How is the kind of changing economic climate affected your business and what you're doing?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and there's no question that it's got kind of a varying view or a different perspective from each of those lines of business, particularly as you think about the mid-sized business that we have and then the small franchisees that are under 50 employees. And as we've reflected and thought about this, we've gone back to the 2008 recession. And during that recession, we had a really important realization. And that realization was that we didn't have a cash culture within our organization. We didn't focus on the cash coming in, the cash going out. We were too heavily focused on the income sheet and the balance and the overall income statement. And as we thought about our business, we realized that we needed to develop that culture and involve our stakeholders in a cash culture. And so we really kind of went down a path of establishing a cash culture within our organization, it took really 3 key steps. The first was, and this has been mentioned, we built a 14-week cash flow tool. And this cash flow tool for us has become really the engine behind what's coming in and going out in our business. And it has a variety of components, the ones that would be obvious, the inflows coming in from accounts receivable. And in our case, we get deposits on our projects in a lot of cases. And then the outflows, which are paying our vendors, paying our landlords, paying for products and materials, paying our employees. And so in this tool, we look on a weekly basis at all of the inflows and all of the outflows and determine exactly where things are going to shake out if we were just to take care of all of the obligations on a week-to-week basis. Now, we have to look at some historicals to be able to see what our collection history has been, for example. And there's no question right now that our collections have dropped off. And so we've had to do some modeling, like Steve talked about, to reduce what we anticipate collecting, and then from there look at our accounts payable and determine how are we going to organize our accounts payable such that we can take care of all those that we are obligated to pay. And as a part of that exercise and as a part of this cash culture, we've organized and set up a meeting on a weekly basis with all of the stakeholders and managers in our organization. And we rank order and prioritize all of our vendors and payables that we have. And we go through and we have a discussion and we decide and make determinations about what can and can't be paid, should they be paid or not. We had a situation just a couple weeks ago where we had a payment that was scheduled to go out, and one of our managers raised their hand and said, hey, wait, we shouldn't pay that yet because the vendor hasn't fulfilled their entire obligation yet. So we were able to put pause on that and move that to a later date. So this culture has created those types of discussions within our organization that have been very beneficial. Something else that we've done as a part of creating this culture is we're meeting, and we're as presidents and managers of our organization, we're forecasting what we anticipate to collect, which also includes historical sales and going back to see what we anticipate and then modeling that into the future. And there's no question in the short-term phase, our sign and lighting service business has been impacted. A lot of restaurants and hospitality has been closed or has seen a significant decrease in their business. And so as such, they're not necessarily as proactive in getting their lights or signs repaired as they once were. And so we're having to adjust those cash flows and adjust those inflows as a result of that. And then I think a couple other important best practices that we've implemented as we've thought about this cash culture within our organization. And I should mention, we've taken these same principles and we've worked with and are working with our franchisees right now and helping them establish this culture within their organization and providing them these tools to be able to identify what their inflows and outflows are going to be for the coming 14 weeks. But a couple of the other components that we've implemented to help us navigate this time and these challenging times, as well as in the past, is we've implemented a down payment model. And if your business is one that could implement a down payment model, I would encourage it. Look at the lines of business that you offer, the points of which you can create revenue, and see if there's ways to move forward some of those payments. We've also implemented progress payments. We have projects, particularly larger projects, that span 12 months, 18 months, 2 years. And so in the contracts with those customers, when our project gets to a certain point, we will demonstrate that we've gotten to the specific point in the contract, and then we'll require a progress payment for us to continue on in that project. And that's been also helpful for us as we manage our cash flows. And the last couple things that I just share, Matt, we've established minimum bank account balances within our operating businesses. And not only minimums, which are the point in which we start to wave the flag and say we've got some challenges, but also we've set goals and things that we want to achieve from a savings perspective. And that is a part of our discussion during the 14-week cash flow meeting that we have. How is our business or businesses doing week over week? And are we reducing our cash balances, or are we staying flat, or are we increasing? And that's getting particular attention right now due to the reduced cash flow that we've seen from our customers. And so we're diligently thinking about how to manage that, whether that means we tap a bank line of credit that we might have available to us, or tap strategic reserve funds that we've set aside for challenging times. And then the last thing that we've really focused on and started to implement is we recognize that COVID-19 or the 2008 recession it's not just a one and done scenario. We recognize that there might be future challenges. Just over the weekend, several of our offices were impacted by the tornadoes that went through in the Midwest. And so we've taken these tools and these resources and these learnings that we're having from COVID-19 and past experiences and putting them into a disaster recovery plan so that we're better suited for what may come in the future, whether that's another pandemic or a natural disaster or something of the sort. And so those are some of the critical things that we've done to manage our cash and to create that cash culture within our organization here at Jesco.
I really like that, Josh. I mean, I think, it provides some nice optimism too, because in a sense, you guys have been through tough times in the past, right? You weathered the 2008 crisis and actually learned from it and kind of changed your business in a manner that actually was then able to thrive as a result of kind of the lessons you learned in 2008. I guess one of the things I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about is, you said you kind of learned that you needed to care about cash starting in 2008. Can you talk a little bit about how you maybe shifted focus? I mean, how did you convince the employees and the different stakeholders to kind of have a little bit of this different mindset, if you will?
Yeah, so it took time, and it's not complete by any means. We are constantly refining our culture and our focus, and particularly that cash flow tool, to make certain that it's up to date and helping us in its best possible way. But one thing that we did that really changed the overall perspective is we set a goal, and we had an objective that we wanted to get our company out of debt. And in order for us to get out of debt, you have to be able to generate cash flow, and you have to be able to pay that debt off. And so we set an organizational goal and individual business goals to contribute specific percentages of our overall business cash flow and revenues to paying down our corporate debt. And that alone really helped us focus and brought people, kind of unified individuals, all of our stakeholders on one specific objective. And I would relate it similarly to setting a specific percent that you want to see achieved as a net income number. But we just focused on it as if it was that, but for cash and the amount of cash that we wanted to set aside and to be able to then pay down our debt.
Yeah, it's interesting. And again, the title of the seminar, Cash is King. So I think it makes sense to have that focus. I also want to then make sure we have time to get to any questions that audience members might have. And we've got a few questions already that I want to kick to the panelists. But if you guys do have questions as we're kind of going through the talk, feel free to submit them via the chat window, and we'll try to get to them. One of the first questions I have is, some of you have kind of been asking about the changing economics of the labor market. And so someone was kind of asking, what happens if your employees basically can make more money as a result of maybe unemployment insurance or some of these other options than they can with actually coming to work? Do you have ways of kind of dealing with that? And so I don't know if there is an easy answer for that, but I'm curious to maybe get some different perspectives on how you might think about that. And I kind of think, maybe Rachel and Eric, if you guys have thought a little bit about it, sounds like you guys have worked quite a bit to try to create a community and try to make sure that everything sticks together. Do you have any thoughts on how you might deal with a situation like this, where maybe there's a concern your employees might not come back?
That concern is absolutely paramount from my perspective. There are times there are certain employees where it honestly may be better for them to collect the unemployment, especially with how some of the rules and regulations have been relaxed in this event. So in that case, when that happens, it is better to let them go that road so that they have a better opportunity to support their family.
But do you have thoughts then too? I mean, is there a way in which you hope that they'll come back? I mean, do you try to keep communication lines open, or do you have other ideas on how you might interact with them given that kind of atypical situation?
We've always had a really as well as we can, just clear communication with our teachers and our front desk staff. And even when this thing first started happening, we 100% let everybody know that they need to take care of them first, and that they have absolute ability to teach some of these online classes right now if they'd like to, help in other ways where we can create ways for them to make income. But if it is better for them, if it is better for their family to do something different or to collect unemployment, apply for their own different ways of making money, they have open space to do that. And I feel like we've spent the last years absolutely creating a kind of a family-like environment with our studio. And they know that we mean what we say and that they will be welcome back if that is what they want to, even if they're not currently working with us, because we know that they need to take care of they and their family, and we might not be able to take care of them the ways that they need to right now. But we just kind of hold this open space that they're welcome back if and when it makes time.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I think, a general theme we've heard from a lot of the panelists today is that communication really is key as well, right? So you want to make sure that you're communicating with all of your stakeholders as much as possible, with the hope then that they kind of have the information, they know what you know. Again, if you guys have questions, feel free to submit them in the chat window. One other question that we've gotten from the audience is, Sherilyn talked a little bit about the different legal avenues that people had at their disposal if they couldn't pay their bills. And so she talked a little bit about things like forbearance and maybe loan modifications. But I think a natural follow-up question, if you're going to do a forbearance or if you're going to do a loan modification, does this affect your credit in any way? I mean, does it affect future things? So Sherilyn, I don't know if you have any thoughts on kind of what other implications are there if you end up going through a forbearance or a modification?
So it's my understanding that when we're talking about a forbearance agreement or a loan modification, as long as it does not include some sort of forgiveness of debt, that's what triggers a lender's requirement to report to the IRS for purposes of collecting taxes on the additional forgiveness of debt. That simply entering into a forbearance agreement or loan modification itself should not trigger those negative warnings, because you would be current based on those forbearance agreements. You're going to have a written plan in place that says make these payments X, Y, and Z over time. And as long as you fulfill those, that's not a 30 or 90 day or 220 day deviation from where you are. If we're talking about a DBA or a personal business where your personal credit's at risk, I think you could include and negotiate in your forbearance agreement that they would continue to report the debt as current to credit bureaus as long as you're satisfying the terms of the forbearance agreement.
Yeah, and I would echo that from a banker standpoint. I know we're not reporting these modifications of forbearance or current deferrals on payments to any business credit agencies at this point. So, I would say, generally speaking, you're not going to have issues, but I would definitely check with your bank and ask.
Excellent. Yeah. So thank you, Kurt and Sherilyn, for that. One other question I've got, maybe Steve can kind of speak to this, since Steve has been dealing this for a while and he's in the food industry. We've got some restaurant owners who are kind of asking questions, and obviously, it's tough to manage cash flow at a restaurant in good times. Can you talk a little bit about maybe what a restaurant owner could be doing right now? Do you have thoughts on what this is going to look like going forward and different things that they might be able to do?
I think for the restaurant owners, it's difficult because as we've seen, they're the ones that have tremendous drop in their business and their revenues. I think that the best things really to do is, in many cases, I think that hopefully they can have good, clear communication with landlords and hope that the landlords are able to work with them. I'm through just personal relationships as well as business relationships, I have spoken to a few restaurants, and they said that the landlords were very willing to work with them. And so if you look at their cost bar, looking at their fixed and variable costs, rent is a big piece of their fixed costs. So if they can work something like that out, they can kind of use the selling pitch that said, I might be a part of your problem now, but I'm also part of your solution when things turn around. So you're going to need a tenant. You don't want to have an empty restaurant in your shopping center or in your, strip mall, whatever you want to say. So that's something that you could look at. Also for them, looking obviously at the online options and really running a skeleton crew. I think that's about all that they can do. Restaurants are very, very hard because they have AP, but the food has been eaten. They don't have accounts receivable. So that's a very, very difficult challenge for restaurants. But I think in looking at understanding what costs they can reduce and clear communication with vendors, assessing the PPP loan, doing the best they can there, and also working with their big payables, the big fixed commitments they have to try to delay and get some kind of a rent holiday, I think would be the best advice I could give to a restaurant owner.
Great. Thank you, Steve. Another question I've got, and maybe this is for Kurt, is, are you required to spend the money exactly as you applied for? Or can you kind of divide it up and maybe try to make it last longer? So could you take a pay cut, or, could you try to negotiate a rent cut and then kind of spread the money out a little bit more? Or exactly how do these loans kind of work?
That's a good question. And the intent when you apply for the loan, you need to be honest, and you're going to make an attestation to the government as to what your purpose for the loan is. And then from that point, if you have to veer from that intent, if you want to, lower salaries, lower payroll, take pay cuts, et cetera, that's fine. And when it all gets reconciled, so what happens is you take out a PPP loan, and over the next 8 weeks, you calculate what you spent in payroll, what you spent in rent, what you spent in utilities, the qualifying expenses over that period of time. And the utilities, rent, and non-payroll stuff can only be a max of 25% of the total, but they'll prorate. And so your debt will be forgiven by the percentage that equated to the loan amount. The rest will remain, and you'll pay back over a 2-year period at a 1% interest rate. So it's still very attractive, even if you don't maintain the same level of payroll or expenses and you end up using money for other purposes. You're still ending up with a big benefit, even if the amount of forgiveness ends up being a fraction of what you thought it might be.
Interesting. Thank you, Kurt. Another question, I guess, is, so Steve, if I recall, you were actually in China in January. And so you guys actually get to see kind of what's going on ahead of everyone else. And in fact, because you have economic ties, you're probably seeing data better than everyone else. I know there's been a lot of discussion about kind of data quality in the pandemic and kind of what numbers are fact checked. Do you have any perspective on how the recovery is actually shaping up in China, what the real data is starting to look like?
Well, it's a very, very interesting question, and I'll try to be diplomatic here. I did leave on the 14th of January, and I first heard, I'd heard about it, and the people in our Hong Kong office gave me a mask to wear in China, and I said, it's probably no big deal. I haven't heard much about this. But then as we watched it evolve, it looks like from everything we're seeing, there is a recovery. But back to that restaurant and food service question, the restaurants are still struggling. Mathematically speaking, my guess is the numbers are light out of China, but I do believe that they were able to recover quite quickly. And one aspect is it was their Chinese New Year holiday. So they have that mass migration where everybody goes back to their hometowns. They can shut things down due to a political regime, which we don't have. So they were able to shut down a little more quickly. But I don't know that really, if you look at the numbers, it looks like the death percentage, et cetera, is greater outside of China. And that may not be completely accurate. But then again, it's hard to say how much testing was done there. But from what we're hearing there, they are truly seeing things come back. And, you're seeing maybe perhaps some reinfection, but they claim it's imported. So it's interesting. But the Asian countries, for a long time due to SARS, they do check temperatures much more frequently than we do. In the Hong Kong airport, in the airport in Seoul, and the airport in Tokyo, there are still stations now showing that you have to have your temperature checked. That's a foreign concept to us as Americans. So I think some of this we're going to have to modify the way we think about things if we really want to see the recovery.
Interesting. Thank you, Steve. Another quick question I have for Kurt is, right now, again, you guys are a small business trying to help small businesses. And at a time like this, I mean, this is really a chance where financial intermediaries can really come and help save the real economy. The question is, are the banks going to be able to do this? I mean, I think there's a little bit of concern that maybe the banks will eventually run into trouble if they're asked to do too much. Do you have any thoughts about that, especially at kind of the local level? How do the Utah banks look right now?
Yeah, Utah is a very unique state, and we have one of the strongest banking communities of any state in the country. We're consistently ranked in the healthiest, most profitable, most well capitalized, and most liquid banks in the whole country. And so I can speak for our bank, and I can tell you we entered this with very strong capital levels and very strong liquidity levels. And we've actually even been able to grow our liquidity levels over the last 60 days. And so, we feel well prepared. I know a lot of the local bankers and heads of local bankers, and I have a lot of confidence that we're well prepared. We also have an incredible, as I mentioned before, amount of regulatory support that's not been there necessarily in past crisis or recessions. And so, regulators are allowing a temporary lowering of minimum capital levels. They're providing a bunch of liquidity facilities for banks to go to and borrow money at very cheap rates to turn around and lend to our customers. All of these things combined are really going to help us carry through. Now, it's not to say that every bank's going to survive at the end of this, but I feel right now it looks like the banks are in much better condition, certainly better than the Great Recession we just went through 10 years ago.
Thank you, Kurt. And I think, as we've kind of seen too, I think a lot of the financial services companies are much better prepared this time than they were in 2008. So hopefully that continues to be a chance for them to kind of help all the business owners out there. I have one other question out there for Cody. So from what I understand, the state legislature for Utah is going to meet, I think, this week. And I guess there's some questions about different things they might be able to do to help stimulate the economy and to help small business owners. So do you think, like, for example, should they take the money that they use right now as a marketing budget for the state of Utah to get tourists to come here? Should they apply that money some other way? Are there other things that they should be doing to try to change, kind of how money is being allocated within the state to help business owners?
So yeah, that a legislative session is supposed to happen this Thursday, and it can be in for up to 10 days. From a marketing perspective for tourism specifically, I have just recently started as the executive director for the Utah Tourism Industry Association, and that's something we've actually been working to protect. So when we look at our TMPF or our TRT dollars, which are used for marketing purposes, we really want to ensure that we are protecting those. And the reason why is, even though it might seem like a lot of money on the surface, when you divide it up by, say, all of the hotel rooms, and really you couldn't just talk about hotels, you'd also have to talk about restaurants, and there's so many businesses that are impacted by tourism that you wouldn't necessarily realize that it ends up being a very small percentage. So even if we look at like what the Go Ed office did with their $10 to $11 million package that they put together, they had over 2,000 applicants in the first 3 days of applications. So you could have anywhere from $5,000 up to $20,000. So if everyone requested the $20,000, that'd be $40 million right there. And at the minimum, it's $10 million. So it just shows how quickly that money evaporates. And if there's a property owner like Ruby's out in Bryce Canyon, which has 700 rooms, if he got $5,000, that's not going to do anything to keep his business alive. But if we do market really strategically and effectively, then that is going to make a difference for everyone. It's going to make a difference for retailers, for restaurants, for hotels. So we've been fighting really diligently to make sure that we can protect that money. And the state is working on bringing back the Mighty Five campaign, which was our most successful marketing campaign that we've ever had. And so they are already in the process of putting that together. So when the time is right, we can be ready to turn that back on, focusing originally on drive markets and then moving out to like the some direct flight markets as well. But primarily at the drive markets where we're focused. And I think that's the best way for us to get our, specifically in my industry, that's the fastest way for us to get going back to some kind of normalcy.
Thank you, Cody. And I think I can safely speak for everyone on the call too, that we're all looking forward to getting back to the national parks when we get a chance. So, all right, so we're almost out of time here for today. So I want to ask one last question, and I'm gonna turn this to Rachel and Eric. So you guys really are operating a service business that just necessarily involves people getting together in close contact. Do you have thoughts? I mean, in some sense, do you think banks are going to treat you differently just because you have kind of a different source of risk than maybe some other businesses? Is there anything you guys can do maybe to try to mitigate these types of risks going forward?
Well, I think the biggest thing that we have to do is is pay attention to what the advice is from a distancing perspective. It's very easy to operate our studio in a manner that respects the distance of being 6 feet apart, of not having personal touch, and of really being able to be together and yet separate all at the same time. So from our perspective, it would be very easy to do that and start to support those sort of regulations as things ease up.
I want to add something too, that because we are in a unique neighborhood where almost all of the businesses are very small businesses, some of them are just a single employee business owner. And I think that we have a really strong rapport with each other, and that by relying on each other as businesses, and even if we're not fully open yet, or if we have unique circumstances where maybe we have to operate a little bit differently, that by sharing the word about each other and by supporting each other, reminding our own students and clients to also support the neighborhood restaurants if they're doing takeout, the boutiques that they have online offerings, things like that. Those same business owners that we're supporting are also more likely to support us in the ways that they can. And I do think it is one of those things that if we stand together and realize that we're not alone, that it will make an incredibly big impact on recovery.
Excellent. Thank you, Rachel and Eric. And with that, I want to turn things over to Taylor Randall, who is the Dean of the David Eccles School of Business at the University of Utah. And I want to thank everyone for sharing their experiences with us today. It's been really valuable. Taylor?
Matt, thanks for being such a spectacular moderator, and thanks for all of our panelists for sharing your experiences. We learned a lot here today, and it's going to help us save our businesses. Special thanks as well to you viewers for tuning in. We're here every Tuesday and Friday. We thank the George S. and Dolores Dory Eccles Foundation for underwriting this series. And we've got some good news. As you've been hearing in the national press, we're beginning to make a turn. We're beginning to think about how we reopen this economy. This Friday, we'll have the leaders of our major healthcare systems with us to discuss what they have been doing to get Utah back to work. We'll follow that up next Tuesday about specific tools that you need to get your business back to work. Thanks again for coming. We appreciate you. Keep your wits about you. We're going to get through this together. See you on Friday.